I wasn't planning to make a video about Frank Turek's tweets, but I saw this tweet this morning and I thought that my response would be rather too fulsome to be practicable for Twitter. So here we are with a video. All right, so he writes, I've hardly ever seen a so-called deconstruction where somebody leaves Christianity, they deconstruct their faith, that does not somehow bring up sexual behavior as a reason they left Christianity. There are several things that concern me about this tweet. So the first thing I want to point out, he begins by qualifying. He says, I've hardly ever seen this. Now, when he uses that language, what he's trying to do is protect himself against a hasty generalization objection. In other words, that you've generalized about groups in too quick a manner. And what he can simply say is, wow, but I didn't say everybody. I simply said that I've usually seen this. Now, fair enough, but the main point still remains that what he functionally ends up doing is stigmatizing the group generally because of his generalization. This is no different than in June of 2015 when Donald Trump launched his political campaign by talking about Mexican immigrants being rapists and murderers. He could also say, yeah, but I also noted that some, I assume, are good people. But nonetheless, by making that general statement about associating rapists and murderers with Mexican immigrants, he has functionally stigmatized an entire group. And when Turek says he's hardly ever seen anybody who engages in this behavior without this motivation, he's functionally stigmatizing the entire group of deconverts. The second thing is, note he uses the language so-called. So, Bob, obviously, when he says so-called deconstruction and then highlights it with scare quotes around deconstruction, what he ends up doing is calling into question the legitimacy of the deconstruction itself, suggesting that it is not, in fact, a legitimate, honest deconstruction or an honest loss of faith. The third thing is that he uses the active voice for these people. He says that they deconstruct their faith, not that their faith was deconstructed, not that they lost their faith, but that they sought to lose their faith. And of course, that then fits in with his idea that people are generally have a moral motivation against God in order to get rid of their faith. Now, is this in fact the case? This is not my experience. For the most part, my experience is that when people end up leaving Christianity, it was a long struggle. And I certainly believe more often than not, people didn't want to lose their faith, but certain things happen in life. Maybe they experienced some sort of crisis, a instance of suffering, things like that. And then they couldn't find their questions about the Bible answered. And then eventually they began to struggle and they went through a dark night of the soul and they ended up losing their faith. It wasn't that they were actively seeking to take everything apart, as Turek suggests. And then finally note this, that he uses the term sexual behavior as this main reason why people actively seek to deconstruct their faith. Now, he doesn't, of course, say it, but it's pretty clear to me that for the most part, what Turek here is referencing is references to quote unquote sexual behavior that is outside of a monogamous heteronormative framework, right? So, for example, clearly at the front here are people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, right? All right. So, if keeping that in mind, first of all, well, a couple things at the very least. If we just focus on those people, so it's not just people who want to do something, it's also people who have witnessed the struggle of people who are lesbian or gay. So for example, parents who themselves may be heterosexual, but they've seen the pain and struggle of their own children. The second thing is Turek reduces this to sexual behavior, I think quite intentionally, instead of talking about something like matrimony, right? That these people are seeking relationship, a long-term meaningful relationship with somebody of the same sex. No, he reduces it simply to the sexual act, which is as grossly reductionistic when it comes to people who are same-sex attracted as they would be opposite sex attracted. To suggest that heterosexual people are only interested in sexual behavior would be grossly reductionistic. Now, let's also focus on the bigger issue here, because for people who are on the LGBT spectrum, the issue is not simply sexual behavior or matrimony as such. It's the broader issue of civil rights and social justice. So if you think back to the 1960s, there was a famous Supreme Court case in the United States called Loving, where it was a Caucasian man and an Afro-American woman who wanted to have the right to marry within the state that they were from. And the state deprived them of that right because it didn't allow for interracial marriages. And they went to the Supreme Court and achieved that right. Now, there are many people today, of course, who look at the claim that gay people should not be allowed to marry as the same kind of civil rights, social justice issue as gaining the right for interracial marriage in the 1960s. And so rather than just talk about sexual behavior, Turek could have talked about questions about matrimony and long-term relationships, civil rights and social justice, and that those are some of these key factors that bring about this deconstruction. Because I hope you can appreciate that once people begin to view Christianity as being opposed to civil rights and social justice, then that does indeed create a pretty significant problem for Christianity. So to conclude, essentially what Turek says in his tweet is this: most people in his experience leave Christianity because they want to have an excuse to indulge in hedonistic sexual pleasure on their own terms rather than God's terms. And as you can imagine, he's simply repackaging his interpretation of Romans 1, verses 18 and following. Well, it seems to me that what Turek is then essentially doing here is as follows. First of all, he's poisoning the well. So he's undercutting any objections people may have, any narrative they may have of personal struggle of faith or deconstruction by saying, well, ultimately, if you're honest with us, you will acknowledge that you are really motivated by a sexual desire and desire for sexual behaviors. Second, it's then functionally an ad hominem, that he's stigmatizing an entire group and attacking an entire group, not looking at the arguments and evidence and the personal narrative, the stories that people have about their deconstruction, but rather he's simply making this broad brush allegation about people generally. Third is this really then is slanderous, right? You're slandering people by attacking their motivations and suggesting that this was not in good faith, that really the arguments are rationalizations to justify your own sinful behaviors. And that, frankly, is prejudicial. And it's very inhospitable, which leads me to my last point. It's a fundamental violation of the golden rule to treat others as you would want to be treated, that Christians like Turek would presumably not be very happy if somebody came along and said all Christianity is the product of wish fulfillment, that you really can't handle the idea of a godless universe, and so you create a little daddy in the sky as a security blanket to help you comfort with the enemy, protect yourself against the enemy, the meaninglessness of existence. Turek would say, that's not true. That's an ad hominem. That's poisoning the well. That's slanderous. That's prejudicial. That's a violation of the golden rule. And you know what? Turek would be right. To dismiss all Christian belief as being motivated by wish fulfillment is really quite unfair and unjustified. But by the exact same measure, for him to say through his hasty generalization, which it indeed is, to functionally stigmatize an entire group as simply being motivated by sexual behavior and using their arguments, their rationale, their whole narrative as simply a cover to justify their own licentious desires. That is itself a deeply uncharitable and unneighborly action.